Hey, this is the Well Advice Channel too. What I want to talk about today is the question of did Yasuke exist? So if you are interested in knowing if Yasuke, the historical black Japanese samurai figure actually existed, then watch this video in order to find out if he did in a logical, unbiased way. So you can know if he actually existed or not. Okay, so now I mentioned that, let's get started. So when it comes to the topic of did Yasuke exist, um, the figure that we've all become quite familiar with, especially with Assassin's Creed Shadows, the simple answer to that question, this very controversial figure, particularly because of that game, and also all the entertainment stuff out there, the simple answer to that question, if he existed or not, is yes, he did exist. And not only did he exist, he actually was a samurai. Now, the reason why I say that is not because of some so called, leftist woke conspiracy theory. The answer to that question is simply down to the fact of the matter that Yasuke is simply, um, when you look at it, in all honesty, um, it literally makes sense that he was those things, okay? Because the thing, which of course I'm going to get to, because this is the argument, every one single person who makes the argument that Yasuke he didn't actually exist, or he was, or if he existed, he was just a court gesture sort of thing and all that type of stuff. The simple answer to that question, you know, to that question, in all honesty, when it comes to debunking that question, to put it bluntly, is the question, or I should say, just in general, the question that they always tend to use all the time is that, well, he wasn't a samurai because there's not much written sources about him and this and that, blah, 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 blah. But they also tend to not take into account the mindset of people at the time. Because the truth of the matter is, anyone who knows anything about the mindset of people at the time, specifically when it related to black people, you know, let alone anyone who wasn't considered extremely important, is that people didn't tend to record things like they do today. There's not going to be, of course, a lot of handwritten pieces of paper documenting someone who, of course, the Portuguese themselves despise and consider to be a so-called African, slave, and so on and so forth, okay? And of course, the Japanese people themselves would probably be hesitant to do that as well, especially when you take into consideration the fact that a lot of them, of course, the ones who, of course, hung around the Portuguese and so on and so forth, who, of course, would have been a more educated portion of the population, you know, during a time period where obviously anyone who knows anything about history knows that like easily 99% of the population of the world, and Japan was no different at the time, did not know how to read. So obviously, read and write for that matter, to be more exact. So obviously, the ones who obviously would have been the ones writing the sources would have been a more educated portion of the population. So if you have the more educated portion of the population who interact with obviously um the Portuguese, who pretty much try to brainwash them to just see black people as so called losers, if anything. The simple answer to the question is, of course, a lot of them are probably not going to really document him very well because he was considered a slave. So, as a result of being considered a slave, he was considered a so called loser. So, as a result, of those particular things, you can see why they would not document it, at the time, because there's a huge history actually of there being a refusal to document black people for that matter, especially when it came to things like combat, such as the fact that slave revolts that actually happened a lot and there was quite a bit and they were massive, tended to not be really well recorded for that matter. So the fact of the matter is that the fact is that obviously as a result, you know, no surprise, the Portuguese, of course, would have probably put a lot of effort and maybe pressure to make sure that they didn't record, obviously, the much about the existence of Yasuke and his story for that matter, okay? Because obviously, as a result, no surprise, they would not feel comfortable about it because, of course, I'm certain it would feel threatening to them, the idea of like a black person who's actually, well, can fight back, if anything, for that matter. Okay, so that's the simple truth of the matter. Okay, the idea that Yasuke simply didn't exist is complete bullshit, for that matter. Okay, or that he wasn't a warrior, to be more exact. Okay, the idea that he didn't do it because there is physical documentation, and samurai was pretty much literally the only caste system that they really had for status. Like being a warrior was a form of status, and of course, people make some bullshit excuses. Well, samurai could mean different things, and so on and so forth. But that's a stupid argument, especially when you take in consideration, the time period this was in. This wasn't during the Edo period. This was during a time when Japan was in constant war with themselves. So to say that they wouldn't have used them for warfare purposes is kind of stupid, for that matter. Okay, for that matter, and not just kind of stupid, it is stupid. Especially when you take in consideration the fact that they some way somehow would single out Yasuke and get so offended by the idea of him in the first place, when he's just simply a samurai who lived so long ago doing his job. The simple truth of the matter is they're just simply trying to piss him off. They just simply don't like the idea of a black samurai, for that matter. And that brings me to the second point of this whole idea that Yasuke was not an actual full-blooded samurai, especially when you take in consideration the fact that wouldn't they want to use someone who's a samurai, use someone like him, for that matter, to be more exact, as a samurai, because of course he was, of course, a very strong person. He's was, for crying out loud, a freaking slave. And according to some sources, which is definitely believable, he came from a part of Africa that had a warrior class. And obviously, one thing is for certain, though, he was a very tall man and a very strong man from reports. They said that he had a strength of 10 oxen, especially, when you take in consideration the fact that Japan, that at the time, at least, the average Japanese person, specifically non-samurai, was like 5'2" and 5'3", and he's easily over 6 feet tall. Why wouldn't they want to use someone like him for an advantage over, obviously, people who he's going to be fighting against? Something's kind of not adding up here with the whole argument, to be honest with you, that he wasn't actually a samurai. Okay, for that matter, okay? That's the simple truth of the matter. He was a samurai, for that matter, okay? And that's the problem with this whole thing, is that the simple truth of the matter when it comes to this whole thing, and I've seen this a lot every single time related to anything related to African history, is that there's always this bias against anything related to black people, okay? It's always, I don't believe that could have happened, okay? Whether it could be the idea that Mansa Musa was actually the richest man, or that Nubia, for that matter, the greatest rival to Egypt, which was clearly a black civilization, wasn't as powerful, or was this and that, and was more a tributary state to Egypt. Yet there's clearly evidence that they actually conquered them at one point. And it's all this sort of shit that you hear from these so goofy people, is that everything related to black history is always simply, this couldn't have happened, there's no way this would have happened, and this and that. And all this shows you how a lot of these people are like, okay? For that matter, everything related to African history is simply, it couldn't have happened, okay? And there's always this intense hatred. Even when you look at the story of Yasuke himself, like, how do you get offended by the story of Yasuke? There's a difference between being offended by Assassin's Creed Shadows, which obviously is a stupid, silly game, versus getting offended by the idea of Yasuke himself. Because the simple truth of the matter is, they don't like the idea of a black person being actually relevant in the world, actually being capable of great things. And why is there always this huge level of skepticism, mysteriously, anytime there's documentation of a black person who did this particular thing? And we're not talking about the stupid ones who claim this and that, or Hannibal. Well, not even Hannibal, but like people like, for example, the first emperor of China was black, or the first European king was black. Those stupid people, who do that stuff. We're talking about direct African history that actually relates to Africa. And that's exactly what I'm trying to get at here. The simple truth of the matter is that That is what I'm talking about. They just always try to discredit our history every single time. And this is definitely a part of that so-called thing. You can even tell when they say that stuff. Even when you confront them online, you can clearly tell they show their true racism quickly. Because the simple truth of the matter is he's a black person. So they as a result feel threatened. And anything related to our own actual real history, not some bullshit that we had nothing to do with, they get offended by. Because simply put it, they don't like black people. That's really about it. It's really about it. They don't like black people. They want to discredit our history, and they always want to spread these false narratives and lies. And that's the simple truth of the matter when it comes to this particular topic. He was a black person, and just simply racist being racist. So anyway, this is my video, and this is all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed it. And just remember, if you like this video and videos like this, remember to thumb this video up and hit the subscribe button. And this is off the scene. Simply put, I'm out. So bye.